Welcome to the North Central U.S. Climate and Drought Outlook for January 2020. This month we will have Peter Goebel from the Climate Colorado Center. He's a service climatologist there, give the presentation, and he's going to cover the entire north central part of the country from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Peter. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks, Doug, for having me with you today, and thanks everyone for joining. So as Doug mentioned, I'm Peter. That is a picture of me on the right-hand side of your screen there. That's during our last big blizzard in Fort Collins, which was probably our most exciting weather event of the last several months, where we got 16.5 inches of snow. I have had a haircut since then, so if you're concerned about that, don't be. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So just first, a little bit of housekeeping. This is first and foremost a reminder that the information that you see here is provided by a number of different entities, and it's really partnerships around the region that make these webinars what they are, and these are all good organizations to get in touch with about your weather climate questions. Our next regular Climate and Drought Outlook webinar will be on Thursday, February 20th, so mark your calendars for 1 o'clock Central Time on the 20th. Your speaker will be Trent Ford, who is the new Illinois state climatologist, and we're certainly looking forward to having him on with us. And then all of these webinars are recorded, and we try to do a pretty good job of making sure that we provide links to the different sources that we show during these webinars. So if you have questions or things that you want to follow up on, those might be good options for you. And then we will have time for questions at the end, so please feel free to hold on to your questions until then. So here's today's agenda, and it's a lot, so I will be moving fairly quickly, but we'll get to those outlooks hopefully here before too long. We'll start with a bit of an overview of 2019. It was an historically wet year for much of the north central region of the US, so we'll touch on a few statistics from that. Then we'll go ahead and take a look at some more recent conditions. I'll look at things over the last 90 days as well as 30 days. And then we'll look at some of our surface hydrology, or our snowpack soils, our streams, and our Great Lakes as well. Then we'll talk about some of the impacts that we're seeing as we are coming off of this big flood year. And then we'll take a look at outlooks and talk about what may be coming down the pipe for spring, as well as some of our major concerns based on what the future weather might be. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get started with the 2019 overview. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take kind of a top-down approach where we look at things first from a really broad scale, starting with the continental US, then we'll focus down to region and state levels, but again, this is going to go fairly quickly. So this is a plot showing the precipitation rank for the continental US, or contiguous US, contiguous US, because not including Alaska, over the 2019 year. The greenish bluish there indicates that it was much above average. The 124 means that it was the 124th driest year of 125. The better way to say that is just it was the second wettest year on record, bested only by 1973. Here is a time series of the precipitation average that we've recorded across the continental US going back to the late 1800s. As you can see, there's plenty of variability from year to year, but we're coming off of a much wetter than normal decade, and 2019 was certainly no exception. All right, here's a look at temperature. We were above average in terms of temperature for the contiguous US. However, that may not make sense for your location, and we'll go into that a little more later. The north central part of the country was somewhat split in terms of the temperature conditions that we saw, but there were certainly areas that were cooler than average. And then here's a look at our US average temperatures going back to the late 1800s. Again, we see a bit of a warm trend going on here. Shouldn't even say a bit of a warm trend, there just is a warm trend. It's the warmest decade that we've had since the turn, or since starting to record, but 2019 was on the cooler side of that. The 2 years most recently that were this colder were 2014, 2013. All right, so here's a look at how temperature and precipitation broke down by state for the calendar year of 2019. So we noticed in the upper Midwest that we were below average in terms of temperature. South Dakota, much below average. And then, of course, the wet conditions is a big talking point when it comes to 2019. There were 5 states that had a record wet year when averaged across the state, both the Dakotas, as well as those upper Great Lakes states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And then other states like Nebraska were close, but all in all, we saw wet conditions across the entirety of the region. Here is a look at the same information using a gridded product, so you just get a little bit better idea of maybe how things looked in your specific location. We see that South Dakota was remarkable in that basically the whole state was record wet, which is unusual, but we also see that those record wet conditions bled into some other states that didn't necessarily have a statewide record. We can see that in states like Kansas, Wyoming, Montana. All right, so here is a look at the time series for South Dakota specifically, and I bring this one up just because of how remarkable it is. So that final point on the plot there shows 2019 for South Dakota, and we see that it was not only a record, it blew the previous record out of the water by almost 3.5 inches. So that's like if you took the previous record and then added a major rain event to it across the entire state. Then I mentioned that other states had record wet conditions, and those are shown with that last bullet point there, respectively for Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Wisconsin. And this is part of an overall trend that's going on, particularly in the upper Midwest. We're coming off of a record wet 5-year period, so it's not just 2019. We've been seeing a lot of this in recent years. And then here are just some of the locations around the north central region of the U.S. that saw records over the year of 2019. And you can see there's a number of major municipalities there on the left, including, say, Chicago at Midway Airport, University of Minnesota at St. Paul. You can go ahead and read down the list, see what's nearest to you. And then we set a few statewide records in my home state. For instance, we had the lowest sea level adjusted pressure, so pressure tends to be lower at higher altitude, so you got to do some adjustment there, but it was from a major storm that came through on March 13th. That was also a storm that led to major flooding in Nebraska. The plot on the left there shows some of the wind gusts that were recorded at Denver International Airport during that storm. We saw our record largest hailstone, and there's a picture of it on the right-hand side there next to a softball. It was nearly 5 inches in diameter, as well as our record hottest temperature on July 20th. All right, so that was a quick overview of 2019. Here is some information about what's been happening lately. And we're going to start with just looking at the month of December over the north central region. And we can see it was, in general, a warmer than normal December, particularly around the holiday season. But then the wet conditions did continue for the upper Midwest. We see that there was top 10 wet ranking Decembers for South Dakota again, as well as Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Some of the areas that were drier, though, particularly with the warmer and drier conditions, did benefit in that some harvesting was able to be taken care of with and field work with the warmer, drier conditions. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but certainly at this point we're looking for conditions that can get folks out in the field because of some of the delayed harvesting conditions that we've seen. All right, so here is precipitation across the region for the last 90 days. And again, you know, it's been wet in the upper Midwest, but we see that there are some areas that have seen a little drier conditions. And at this point, we're probably grateful for that, such as southern Iowa and northern Missouri. And this is the same graphic, but for temperature over the previous 90 days. Most of the region warmer than average, but we see a bit of a difference from west to east with eastern locations within the region like Ohio and Indiana seeing further departures from normal temperature in favor of warmer conditions than areas further west. And then this is just the last month, so we really see those warmer than average holiday conditions stand out, particularly on the eastern edge of the region. Quite remarkable to see temperatures as much as 9 to 12 degrees above average. In some cases, these are more March-like temperatures, or at least more like late February, early March-like temperatures. And the only areas on this graphic here that are below average for the holiday season are in the upper Colorado River Basin, for the most part west of the Continental Divide. And then this is departure from normal precip over that same 1 month time period. We did observe a record wet 3-day event for January in Illinois, and that's well represented here as we see that we, in many parts of Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, saw over 3 inches above average precipitation just over the last month. That's pretty remarkable for this time of year. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of our surface conditions, starting with snowpack. This is a graphic of snowpack over the western U.S., and so much of this isn't necessarily in the region, but if you look at the far right corner of that picture, you can see how snowpack conditions compare to the median, which is a little bit different than the average. But the take-home message here, I think, is that snowpack is in good shape. In some parts of the Missouri Basin where we've had flooding issues, we might prefer to see it a little bit lower, but largely in the average or a little bit above average range. And then here's a look at how some of that snowpack has built over the cold season to date. So much of the snowpack peaks in early to mid-April, as you can see by the red line, which is showing you how snowpack builds in an average year. The shaded blue line is showing you how it's accumulated this year. And you can see that we're a little bit above average for the North Platte Basin. We started out quickly in October and early November, then things tapered off for a bit, and since then it's accumulated more or less like an average year. And then similar story in the South Platte, but we're at 100% of average rather than 108. So here we're looking at a couple areas of the Missouri River Basin. So we're looking first at snowpack above Fort Peck, which is in Montana, and we can see that things have, for the most part, tracked as we would expect in an average year, as they have further down the river at from Fort Peck to Garrison, which is in North Dakota. Here's a look at how Snowcover is currently faring across the north central region. So we see that our biggest areas of snowpack, as we would expect, are in the headwaters of our river basins in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. But there is a fair bit of plain snowpack that is worth mentioning. So across much of the lower elevations of Montana into the Dakotas, we are seeing snowpack. It's less than an inch of snow water equivalent, but when you consider that it's over that wide an area, that does make a difference. And then we see more snowpack than that even at lower elevations in the eastern parts of the Dakotas and going into Minnesota. So that can certainly have an impact once it melts on our river systems. And then this is just another look at the same thing, zoomed in on the Missouri River Basin. Again, we can see the bulk of the snow water equivalent, or liquid water from snow, is either in the headwaters or in the Dakotas. All right, this is a look at soil moisture in the root zone, which is generally about the top 6 feet. And this is a percentile ranking for soil moisture. What you need to know to read this is that the green areas are where we have above average soil moisture. The warmer colors are below. If you're seeing areas that are in blue, that just means that it's basically a record high level of root zone soil moisture for this time of year. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we're coming into the time of year where we expect to see soils continue to recharge. So it's interesting if you have high soil moisture this time of year and things are close to saturated, then as things continue to get wetter, you can have more runoff, which may be problematic down the line. And then this is just a look at how things compare to where we were a year ago. So it's using the same soil moisture model, but here just think that the warmer colors mean soils are drier than this point a year ago, and the wetter colors, or the cooler colors mean it's wetter than this point a year ago. And we can see areas like Kansas and Iowa are drier than this point a year ago, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. These are areas that were quite wet a year ago. Similarly, if we look at, say, the northeast portion of North Dakota, if we were to go back to the last graphic, we see that soils are not necessarily storing above average moisture, but this time of year last year, we had some dry conditions lingering, and I think some area that was being depicted as in drought on the U.S. Drought Monitor. All right, here is a representation of stream flows across the area. And here the cooler colors again mean that we're seeing above average flows for this time of year. So that's crucial. So if you average the flows that we've seen over the last 28 days, this is showing how that compares to the same time of year in other years. So this is not the time of year where we tend to see stream flows peak in the north central part of the U.S. That's typically later in the spring. But for the winter, comparing to other winters, we do see some areas that are even record high flows. That's what the black dots tend to mean. And then here's a look at the current U.S. Drought Monitor. It's no surprise here, given the conditions that we've just gone over, that much of the north central region is drought-free. My state of Colorado seems to be the biggest notable exception, where we had a really dry end to summer, unlike much of the north central region. In the southern portion of the state in particular, and in the southeast portion, things have continued to be dry recently. So that area could use a good snow or two. All right, now we're going to take a look at some Great Lakes conditions. So this graphic is showing you the temperatures over the Great Lakes, and when you see that dark blue coloring, that's when it means that we're getting close to freezing. Oftentimes by this point in the year, we do see more ice on the Great Lakes than we are seeing now. So with those warmer than average conditions, we're seeing continued ice-free conditions across much of the Great Lakes, and particularly Ontario and Erie are still quite warm. We're seeing, for instance, on the southern banks of Lake Superior, as well as parts of Michigan, Huron, that ice is starting to form. All right, so now we're going to show a few graphics showing Great Lake levels currently, as well as their projections going forward. So in these graphics, which will largely tell similar stories, the red line is the lake levels we've seen over the last couple years. The dashed green line is the levels that we're projecting going forward. And then the dashed red or sort of burgundy area is a representation of the kind of uncertainty we have going forward. So it could be on the higher end of that spectrum, it could be on the lower end. And then the dashed blue line is normal. And one thing that you'll see throughout a lot of these Great Lake graphics is that conditions have been well above normal in terms of lake storage. This is for Lake Superior, and we don't expect things to return to normal necessarily in 2020, even as lake levels may go down a bit. All right, this is showing a similar thing for the Michigan Huron system. And as you can see, we were near record levels of lake water storage in June and July of 2019. Things have tapered slightly since then, but still were much above average. Similar story with Erie. It was, a really wet spring that fed into the lakes over the summer, and we'll see what the weather brings this year, but likely to stay above average. Ontario is the one with the biggest uncertainty here, where depending on conditions, things could return more towards average conditions if we are, in this case, probably lucky enough to get a warmer, drier than average spring going into summer. All right, now we're going to take a look at some of the impacts, and then we'll get to that outlook for the spring. So I'm starting the impacts just with a recap of some of our billion-dollar impacts from the calendar year 2019. Flooding in our major river systems was one of the biggest, probably the biggest impact of 2019, and we saw that on both the Mississippi River as well as the Missouri River in March, and on the Mississippi system, those impacts went all the way into July. We had a big hail event in Colorado in one of the most populated areas of the state, where hailstorm can rack up a lot of dollars of damage quite quickly. And then we had a couple severe weather outbreaks over the central US that also did up to over $1 billion of damage. All right, here are some of the agricultural impacts that we are seeing. I'm going to start with some of the impacts from drier than average conditions, which again is only a small portion of the region, but here in Colorado, the southeast end of the state going into southwest Kansas, had dry soils during winter wheat planting season. We saw some poor stands from that winter wheat going into dormancy, and those areas really need a good rain or snow prior to green up to help ensure the crop's success. So the corn impacts here are consistent across a number of different crops, actually. So late planting was a common theme in 2019 throughout much of the north central region because it was so wet. It was hard to get into the fields and get work done, and the wet conditions in the fall as well also have delayed harvests, and in some cases there's still corn or other crops out there. I heard that Illinois still has a little bit of corn to harvest, but then areas like the Dakotas still have quite a bit of corn to harvest. The persistent wet conditions were associated with an increase in disease in cattle, according to a report from South Dakota. And then the flooding did lead to a number of acres that were just never planted to begin with. Now, if we look at some of the recent warm conditions, like I mentioned in Iowa particularly, that was actually quite helpful in terms of drying things out just at the top portions of the soil, getting folks out in the field to do field work as well as finish up harvests. In Ohio, the warm conditions have led to some green up of winter wheat, which is, it's early in the season for that. So it's a bit disconcerting to see winter wheat greening up so early, and there are some reasons that we might not want to see that based on the outlook for February that I'll get into in just a couple slides here. Transportation-wise, yeah, the record 3-day precipitation event that I mentioned in January in Illinois did lead to some flooding and some road closures. For instance, the Kaskaskia River breached the dam, and that caused closures across Highway 51. There was ice storms in early December in Minnesota, causing over 500 accidents. Actually pretty uncommon to have ice storms that far north in the region. And then I mentioned the November blizzard in Colorado in my first slide, and that did lead to some pretty large transportation impacts on the urban corridor. It was falling very hard in the morning when people were trying to go places, which made it really hard for the plows to keep up. And then we've got potential for ice storms this weekend, so we may not be done with these transportation impacts. All right, so hydrologic impacts, and these were big in 2019. For instance, the Missouri River Basin had a near record runoff at Sioux City, Iowa, or sorry, the Missouri River had a near record runoff at Sioux City, Iowa at over 60 million acre feet, which is over twice the average, and only 0.1 million acre feet off of the record in 2011, and that's over 122 years of record keeping. The Missouri River Basin runoff is forecast to be over 2 times the average through April because of all the excess water we've got in our rivers and reservoirs and soils right now, and because this is the time of year where things tend to get wetter, as I said earlier, for this region of the country. The plants and trees aren't growing at this time of year, they're dormant, and that's what can really dry us out, is the plants and trees using some of that excess moisture for evapotranspiration. In terms of hydrologic impacts, there were some stations along the Missouri River Basin that were over flood stage for over 270 days, so a large portion of the year at or above flood stage. And here's a quote from a member of the Missouri River Basin, or the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, about the setup for 2020, saying, "The setup is grim, the worst I've seen in my 30-year career, but the wild card is the precip and temps. If we get below average spring and early summer precipitation, we'll be okay." And that's, I think, certainly what we're rooting for at this point, and hoping not to see a repeat of some of these flooding impacts in 2020. And then we have had some minor flooding on and off in Ohio and Kentucky over the last month. The Army Corps of Engineers at Gavins Point Dam is releasing over twice its normal volumes for this time of year. I believe they'd like to release more, but there's concerns about if you release too much water too fast this time of year, you can end up with ice jams, which is a problem. And then here's just a look at how things fared for the Ohio River Basin. In what we're actually looking at is water year 2019 in the blue on the graphic on the left-hand side of your screen. So a water year goes from October 1st of the previous calendar year through September 30th of the next year. So water year 2019 would be October 1st of 2018 to September 30th of 2019. Record runoff over that water year. Things are more normal now, as we can see by the red. All right, so with that, let's get into the Outlook portion. And we'll start with just the next 7 days. It does look like we have a weather system that's very much moving in this weekend and likely to bring snow to the upper portion of the region in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and may bring ice further down in areas like Kansas City. It looks like the snow in the areas further north could be pretty widespread, so we'll have to keep an eye on particularly transportation impacts out of this one. And then next week, weather models are hinting at another disturbance that could be coming through late week, but it's a little early for knowing the details about that system. So this is a graphic showing maximum temperatures forecast for this Sunday across the contiguous U.S. And if we focus in again on the north central region, we see that there's some chilly max temperatures forecast across states like Iowa and Minnesota up into the Dakotas. Not unheard of cold temps for certain, but definitely some cold air moving in behind the storm. If we look at the next 8 to 14 days, it looks like for our region, a continuation of an increased tilt towards above average moisture over the region, as well as some areas that may see cooler than average conditions. And it just looks like the storm track is expected to stay active. So there's potential for another couple disturbances here. But again, it's a little early for sussing out the details there. Here's the outlook for the month of February. So the Climate Prediction Center did mention that it looked like the models were showing potential for a couple storms to come out of the Alberta area and really have cold air from the Canadian Shield spill in behind it. And so I expect there to be likely a change from the warmer, more balmy conditions that we've seen over the past month. The storms coming out of that area will lead to some upslope flow over the mountains in the headwaters region in areas like Montana and Wyoming, hence the increased odds of above normal precipitation there. You'll notice that over Missouri, Iowa, extending into Indiana, and just sort of the south portion of our north central region, that there's actually an increased chance of below normal precip. If we do have more cold air outbreaks, that tends to shield the area from some of the best moisture that you can get this time of year from the Gulf of Mexico. It tends to block some of that, so that could actually be a positive impact despite the cooler temperatures. This time of year when we have cold outbreaks coming down from the Canadian Shield, it can lead to wind chill concerns as well as just overall bitter cold temperature concerns. We certainly saw some of that around this time last year. However, it's too early to say particularly just how cold these storms are going to get and how broad the impacts will be, but that's certainly something that we'll be keeping a close eye on as we move forward into the month of February. All right, so this is a slide showing the El Nino, La Nina, or El Nino Southern Oscillation conditions. Are we going to stay in neutral conditions? Are we going to go towards El Nino or La Nina? And what the models are hinting at over the Pacific Ocean is that we'll likely stay in neutral conditions. We flirted with maybe having a weak El Nino earlier in this season, but never really got there, and it looks like conditions are just returning more towards neutral. That's a bit problematic from a seasonal outlook perspective because this is one of the few signals that we can hang our hats on a little bit for determining whether it's going to be a wetter or drier year or a warmer or cooler year over the north central region. But with neutral conditions, there's not a whole lot of guidance to go off of. So keeping that in mind, here are the outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center for February, March, April. And it looks like temperature-wise, there's a bit of a continuation of that pattern with seeing perhaps more cold air outbreaks over the northern portion of the north central region. So the upper Midwest states and upper High Plains states like the Dakotas and Minnesota. And then as you get down into Colorado, maybe a bit of a tilt towards increased chance of above normal temperatures in the southwest portion of our region, but a lot of equal chances, and part of that is that we don't have that signal to go off of for El Nino, La Nina. For precipitation, we do see that there's quite a bit of the area shaded in increased chance of above normal precip. I will say this is only a slight lean. This is not a forecast with a lot of confidence, and I think that it's largely banking on trends. So we talked earlier about how the north central region has seen wetter conditions over the last 5 years, so it might be reasonable based on that alone to really lean towards the increased potential of above normal precip. But just to reiterate, this is not a strong signal, and we're again really rooting against the above normal precip for much of the region. We'd like to see things dry out so that folks can get to work in the fields, as well as reduce or mitigate flood concerns into this coming spring with all the excess water that we have in the region. That water is tough to get rid of this time of year. Things tend to ramp up climatologically, precipitation-wise, going into the spring, and we don't really see things start to dry down from, like I mentioned earlier, increased evapotranspiration until a while later into the spring, certainly after things start greening up and growing again. And then here is the Climate Prediction Center's outlook for March, April, May. Much of the same as we saw for February, March, April. We do see a bit of an increase on the southern fringe of our region of increased tilt towards above normal temperatures, but then the signal towards below normal temperatures in the northern portion of the region persists. As well, we see much of the region with still an increase of above normal precipitation. I think this is based on trend for one, and then as you start to get into May as well as into June, you start to consider the fact that if you have a lot of soil moisture there, that creates what we call a land surface feedback, where more of the sun's energy is going into evaporating water than in a normal year, and so that evaporation keeps dew points high, or it keeps the moisture content in the atmosphere high, which can in turn lead to more precipitation falling. So it's kind of a vicious circle there. So here's just a quick in summation slide. We covered in quite a bit of detail that 2019 was a historically wet period for the central region, and it's a continuation of what we've seen in recent years, although 2019 more so than in recent years even. And this excess water has led to numerous impacts: delayed or missed planting, delayed harvest, high flows or dam breaches. And then this time of year, climatologically, we tend to see increases in surface moisture. One of the old adages is, as the days get longer, the storms get stronger. There's truth to that in some ways, and one of the ways in which there's truth to that is we tend to see the volumes of precipitation increase as we go further into the spring. And then the CPC Outlook, or Climate Prediction Center Outlook, is leaning towards wetter than normal for much of the region. And given our current conditions, or just the amount of moisture in the system, even normal precipitation is probably too much for many of us. So with that, I'll wrap up. So again, today's presentation and future presentations will be recorded, and you can find these recordings if there's something that you want to reference. These are just a variety of links that you can follow to satisfy your whims of curiosity when it comes to climate, weather, drought, flooding. And then here is just some contact information for folks around the region. I put my contact information there, as well as my colleague Becky Bollinger, who's been on these webinars before. Dennis Toddy with the USDA Climate Hub and Doug Cluck with NOAA are the folks who are really the masterminds behind these webinars. So feel free to reach out to them if you have questions or want to know more. And then Mike and Natalie work for regional climate centers across the area. Natalie's with the High Plains, Mike's with the Midwest. Brian Fuchs is with the Drought Mitigation Center. So if you have drought questions or concerns, he's a great resource. But with that, thank you so much for your time, and I will leave it there.
Thank you, Peter. Very good presentation. So like Peter said, the summation is that conditions across much of the, I'd say, the Missouri and upper Mississippi really haven't changed, in the Great Lakes Basin for that much, haven't really changed a lot from conditions that we had in the fall in terms of being wet and staying wet. So we're still primed if certain things happen: heavy rainfall, more snow, more frozen soils, that kind of thing. There's probably an enhanced chance of flooding this year for sure. NOAA will release its spring flood outlook in March, so there'll be more information then. And of course, we'll have more information in about a month on February 20th when we hold the next one of these series. So stay tuned. There's a lot more information to come. Thank you all for joining, and we will talk to you next month. And Peter, just a special thanks for you for the second time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me with you.
You bet. Bye-bye.